Okay, so finally, last part of the day, and we have something new actually this year, as this is a DDoS conference. So we have some DDoS candidates who are going to present, 3 of them actually, who have successfully proposed their intended research and is in the process of experimentation and defending their thesis. So I really look forward to these presentations. I think it will be really helpful for anyone who wants to do research or any project to really see how a problem can be defined and proposed in a convincing way, and better think about why and what before the hows and the results. So we'll have Lucy, Shen, and Lyna. All of them actually are third-year DDoS students, DDoS candidates. And so first one, we'll have Lucy, who works with Professor Ali Makawi, and she has a master's from MIT, and her research focuses on building technology simulation, carbon-aware design, and specifically how to harness thermal storage and respond to real-time greenhouse gas emissions. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you, Gulai, for the introduction. So hi, everyone. My name is Lucy, and then I'll be talking about my thesis work on harnessing building thermal storage with time-varying emission signals, a demand-responsive path to lower carbon. I just want to give a quick introduction to my awesome committee members. So we have Holly Samuelson, who gave the keynote today, and also Professor Ali Makawi, who is the founder of the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities. And then I also have a third member, Professor Le Xie, who is in CEAS. He's an electrical engineer. And so let's get started. So just to start with some background. As we all know, in the building industry, especially when we talk about simulations, and especially because buildings have such long life cycle, emission data is always often, especially when we talk about electric emissions, is often treated as a stationary grid average, which shouldn't be the case, because as you can see here, the emission of the same amount of electricity produced actually varies both seasonally and depending on the hour of the day. So treating it with just a singular normalized number can be very inaccurate. So to just give you a closer look of how much these emission factors can vary within the single day. So looking at the 2022 Cambian marginal emission data for Chicago, as you can see here, highlighted in dark green on top, it's what you would see as a daily maximum, and then the thicker lighter green line at the bottom is the minimum. As you can see, they can almost double within a single day. So that's why it's important to take the advantage of the time varying, and that's how we can actually utilize this to lower our emission. So why these emission varies during the day and also varies seasonally? It's because our demand for electricity changes depending on whether you need cooling or heating or other sources within the building. It's demand and emission, it's strongly correlated, as you can see here, overlaid. But again, it's not 100% one-to-one. So a lot of studies have been already worked on improving the efficiency of the building. That's what you would see on the first graph here. So by merely improving the efficiency of a building, you're only lowering your energy consumption, but you still would see the peak and valleys within the same day from the same building. And but then this is actually hard for the grid to accommodate for these use changes. So that's why you see on the bottom left, the load shifting is very crucial in stabilizing the grid and help the grid to accommodate all the building usage for electricity, because none of us want like a blackout hour or something like that during extreme hours. So just to go briefly, so there's limited data on this building grid interaction, and there's also various challenges within how to integrate these demand flexibility. So the goal of what we should do, or what we want to accomplish, is to basically move from this light gray line on the very first graph to this relatively more stable and also lower light blue line in the end. And that's what I'm going to work on with the load shifting ability within my models and simulations. So there are three main objectives for my research. First is to implement a forecast emission-based demand responsive control, and this will be based on our amazing lab here, House Zero. And then to test its city scale, to evaluate it at a city scale, and then also compare the result under different emissions reduction scenarios. And lastly, given that we can do experiments at House Zero, this algorithm that's done through simulation will be implemented and have real-world data validation. So going into more details about the research questions I would want to answer. First is, how effectively can buildings harness their thermal storage to reduce demand at high emission hours through simple on or off or setback heat pump control? And what is the magnitude of the resultant carbon savings? Secondly, how do forecast inaccuracy impact the performance of a demand control system at different scales, single building versus multiple buildings, and how do the results compare to a scenario with perfect foresight? When scaled to urban level, how do the variations in building characteristics and comfort constraints influence the collective effectiveness of this demand responsive strategy? And lastly is, in what way would the outcome of these studies change our current perception of energy efficient design features in buildings? So what is unique about this is I want to bridge the gap and then give more information to designers and architects about how we should design for the future. So going to the hypothesis. So first, my hypothesis is building with substantial thermal storage, like House Zero or other buildings with tap system, can tolerate short-term heat pump shutoffs without compromising occupant comfort, leading to significant reduction in energy usage at high emission hours. Demand control system informed by predicted marginal efficient factors will offer significant emission reductions compared to the baseline, although the forecast inaccuracy could possibly reduce some optimal performance. Large-scale adoption still should yield net carbon benefits. And then building with weaker envelope and minimal thermal mass will exhibit limited demand response potential, as they are unable to maintain indoor comfort during heat pump shutdown periods. So this underscores the critical role of thermal storage and robust envelope design in maximizing load shifting benefits. Lastly, it may be advantageous in climates with both heating and cooling demands to focus on reduced heating loads rather than cooling loads. And then I will explain why I think this way in the future, in the later preliminary results. So just to go into more details about my methodology. So first, I will start with the House Zero simulation. So produce a calibrated model to House Zero and perform the different level of demand response control on this calibrated model. And then once I have an algorithm that I'm satisfied with, I'm applying this to Red-Stock, Comstock models, and I'm going to sample for the whole Suffolk County, which is around 2,000 sample buildings, and there are 5 building upgrade scenarios, which I will go in detail in the next slide, and then analyze the simulation result under different emission metrics. Lastly, just implement the control I found from the first part to House Zero and see how the results differ from my simulations. So these are the 5 building upgrades that I'm thinking to include in my studies. So first is the baseline, and then which is what we have right now as our current state. And then the second case is what if now all the buildings have been electrified with air source heat pump? And then in the C case is what if all of them are trying to respond to demand? And what I'm expecting to see is that some buildings may not be able to maintain the thermal comfort, and during those cases, I'm going to revert this back to their current state and say that they're just not able to perform demand control, they're just unsuited. And then in D case, I'm going to add additional thermal storage to the interior of all buildings and see how that will change how many buildings can be able to respond to demand. And then lastly is to test a case if all buildings have house zero level of upgrades. So that means full electrification, better envelope, and also ground source heat pump. So the demand signal, since we're not in California, there isn't really a real demand signal that we are implementing. How I'm using to predict the demand signal is based on the marginal emission. So basically, as you can see here, because in Massachusetts, we have a lot of renewables, especially PV panels during the day. So where you see the high emission hours is actually it's actually around 4 to 6 p.m. That's when the PV panels start to fade away because the sun is about to set, and then but then all the cooling loads are still coming up. So this is the simple demand control. So basically, it's all it's saying is when the emission is higher than the 90th percentile, turn off your heat pump. That's it's really simple. And then, so just to go into some preliminary results. So first is I start with this really efficient house that has really already have low heating and cooling. And then by performing the demand response, as you can see here, so all the solid line are the baseline case, and then the dashed line is after I've implemented the demand response. As you can see, so on the left is a typical summer day, on the right it's a typical winter day. So I'm basically manually turning off those heat pumps during you see where actually it's trying to use energy. So as a result from this kind of measure, I'm able to reduce the heating energy by 8% and cooling energy by 3%, resulting in a total emission savings of 8%. But what it's actually currently I still have to figure out that's in the trade-off is actually increase the discomfort hours also by 5%, because I'm shutting off the heat pump precisely when the building wants to heat or cool. And then some city scale preliminary results. I have already performed the case A, B, and E. We're using just 10 residential buildings from Boston. So this is the result. 9 out of the 10 buildings for the resident, which matches with what we have currently. So 9 out of the 10 buildings have natural gas furnace as their heating source during the winter. That's why you see you have this big orange color from the baseline case. And as we upgrade to minimum efficiency heat pump, and then in the last case upgrade to ground source heat pump with without existing heating source as backup, you see all the energy start lowering drastically. Looking at this, you might say, oh, the result is great. Everybody should just upgrade to heat pump. All of our energy are reducing drastically, right? But then here's the problem. If we take away the natural gas by only looking at the electricity consumption, what you can see here is from the baseline, we see the summer peak, which is not surprising because everything we do for cooling is using electricity. But then what you see from the different upgrade cases is that we're gonna see double the electricity consumption in the winter months, in the case of Boston, when we have both heating and cooling load, and also in a climate like Boston, which is we have harsh winters. So our grid is just not ready for this. And then this is also like only looking at it from like yearly, like months. You will see the similar curve when we look at daily variations. So that's why the demand response comes in handy and going to be helping to flatten out these curves. So just to conclude, what the outcome expected from this project is include first utilizing the thermal storage to respond to demand and help stabilize the grid from the building sector. And then I call for real-world validation protocol from using the simulations and assess citywide scalability with these strategies. And lastly is to recommend adaptive building design. So in this case, what I'm hypothesizing is maybe buildings should start to consider designing for heating over cooling. So for example, maybe shading isn't the case to go, and maybe buildings or windows should have higher solar heat gain because since we have more abundant electricity source during the summer. So thank you so much for your attention.
I think we have time for one quick question, if there's anybody.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting and innovative, but I just have a very quick question about the heat storage. You mentioned that the scenario is main focus on the winter, so I just want to know what kind of heat storage can be used to store the heat, because I know it's easy to use something like ice to store the cool, but I have no idea what kind of device or something or equipment to store the heat.
Yeah. So I'm talking about so not really season. It's not like I'm storing heat from the summer to use in the winter. It's more like during the daytime when you can heat up or cool a building with concrete. If you live in a thermally massive building, so during the day, when the sun shines on it, you don't get immediately hot during the day, and then the heat might radiate out at night. That's the thermal storage I'm talking about. So it's not really ice or active system like batteries, but just the passive properties of buildings itself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy. And you have 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Apologize. All right, my name is Shen. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Lyna and Gulai, who have done an amazing job preparing the conference, and also thank you, Lucy, for a beautiful presentation. Brilliant, as always. So my research, I'm going to just give the background. This is typical in every presentation relating to this topic, but buildings are responsible for roughly 35 to 40% of global energy use, and they generate a comparable share of worldwide CO2 emissions. So this creates a dual expectation. On one hand, buildings need to provide thermal comfort, and also it has to remain energy efficient. So as a result, we are seeing a growing demand for smart buildings and advanced technologies that can manage this balance. This includes cyber-physical systems, intelligent algorithms, and proactive responsive controls. The hope is that by leveraging these technologies, we can not only enhance indoor thermal comfort, but also achieve much higher levels of energy efficiency. And it is, I think, at this intersection where my research is placed at, between comfort, efficiency, and intelligent control. So overall, the way that my research is structured is into 4 main phases: identify the problem, conduct an empirical study, the development of the system, and evaluation. The problem is identified within the context of moisture management in buildings. The study analyzes moisture dynamics through data and physics. A predictive model and automation system are then developed, and finally the results are validated through experimentation. In the problem, I specifically look at 4 aspects: perception, simplification, imbalance, and context. And my approach to these is to address through detection, absolute quantification, stabilization, and adaptation. Empirical study, by the way, the sound, that's my son, I'm sorry. The empirical study is a collection of data, analysis with both statistical and physics-based methods. formulation of parameters, evaluation of variables, and preparation for the next step, which is the system development. In short, the development of predictive and decision agents. Together, they learn a control policy that enact an action in response. And finally, the evaluation is, going through 3 stages, which is the digital twin, a live setting experimentation, and a cross-context simulation. And overall, this forms the overall overview of my research framework. So within the problem, why humidity? Humidity is a long-standing challenge in buildings. Unlike other comfort factors such as temperature, humidity has effects that are subtle and delayed. For instance, we don't walk around saying, it's dry in here, it feels like less than 30% relative humidity. No. But then we notice these consequences through condensation, musty smells, or some sense of discomfort that can't be quite described. One key reason for this is that there is a sense of oversimplification in terms of metrics. Practice typically leans on relative humidity as primary metric, and relative humidity is dependent on temperature. The same 50% relative humidity at 10 degrees Celsius holds far less water vapor than 50% at 30 degrees Celsius. Yet the risks in these 2 different cases differ drastically. So what about absolute humidity, for instance? It measures water per volume of air, and this value is also dependent on temperature, but also dependent on the volume changes. So they are both not static, which is what I'm proposing as a different approach to use absolute metrics. Conventional systems are imbalanced in terms of humidity because they are conventionally tuned for sensible heat and not latent loads. So humidity control often gets deprioritized. And finally, context matters, and a lot. Climate, material hydraulic buffer capacities, how much materials can hold moisture within them. Air exchange, metabolic rate, how much we the perspiration rate of people by releasing moisture. And all these factors can flip risk within the same relative humidity reading. So those are the problem factors that I'm looking at to address through my research. To further emphasize the need for proper humidity management, humidity impacts into critically in the aspects of comfort, health, and structural integrity. High humidity fosters mold, and I think that's the most notorious thing, as mold is very intrinsic, but also very unique in the sense that a lot of the mold fungi species that inhabit the built environment are xerophilic, meaning that they don't need much to obtain their nutrients, so they grow a lot. And also low humidity, respiratory illness, and static buildup. This can damage a lot of electronics, typically. So controlling humidity regularly demands a lot of energy consumption, but yet moisture is an integral environment load, so influenced by natural processes that we typically cannot control. So I want to point out that my focus is not to eliminate it, but I'll just manage and control it effectively. My research builds upon many efforts that relate to the context of leveraging technologies to improve the ways we diagnose and optimize building operations in relation to humidity. Extensive work has been done over the past decades, leveraging digital tools, mathematics, and physics-based models, and most recently, artificial intelligence. But when it comes to actual operation and action frameworks, a lot of the work clusters on factors such as temperature, CO2, or volatile organic compounds. And humidity has remained mostly within diagnostic and analytical frameworks. So in regards to humidity, some efforts have been made in developing control frameworks, but a common challenge in this is typically lack of data. Structured or sparse data is not favored in the context of data-driven algorithms, and these fail to capture long-term dependencies. Also, often, most of the work done in the current state of the field rely still on relative humidity as the dominant metric. And the reason for this is not because it's more accurate, but because relative humidity is simply easier to measure, hygrometers and sensors are built around it, and also current comfort standards have been established in relative humidity terms. So the current state of humidity regulation has some key gaps. One is data sparsity, as I mentioned, which pushes us towards more simplified or idealized approaches that miss many aspects of moisture dynamics. Fuzzy logic or static rules control that rely on fixed thresholds do not adapt to natural fluctuations either. So this is where I see an opportunities for deploying dense real-time sensing for collection of data. Also allowing for multi-directional actions from a unified control layer and applying AI that is both physics-informed and also uncertainty-aware to develop data-driven proactive control approaches. To address gaps specifically, I start with data shifting from partial dynamics, as I mentioned, from relative humidity to comprehensive dynamics by adding key variables such as humidity ratio, which is the amount of water vapor per mass of dry air, which is static and temperature independent. Also adding dew point temperature, which is a condensation safety margin. Adding to this also AI, where given the data density available to me for this research, I investigate predictive models that learn cross effects to predict joint trajectories, which in short means a robust multi-target model that works with time series. And finally, a control algorithm that shifts from linear to adaptive nonlinear policies. This is based on basic reinforcement learning knowledge, but also model predictive control learning. The agent chooses actions based on the predictions, and finally, different states define what priorities must be addressed. So the objectives are basically develop a control framework, balance multi-trade-offs, and finally integrate continual learning for adaptability and scalability. The methodology is to build a predictive sequential model, a control algorithm, implement the adaptability as mentioned, validate and deploy and evaluate. So I'm just showing like the overall framework of what this is going to be looking like. And for the sequential model, basically, these are just typical procedures that we take for any data-driven or machine learning work. And finally, the control algorithm, this is a bit something that I want to explain a bit. Control is driven by principles of reinforcement learning, as I mentioned. An objective function is established with constraints and penalties, and a policy to map the actions to the state. I'm using a meta controller, which is a Bayesian optimization technique, as to support with parameter space exploration, and this together become what I'm calling the adaptive control framework. The control, as of now, it's named neural network-based MPC. Please excuse my terrible naming skills, but the high-level mathematical representation expresses the objective function is basically interpreted as every step the model predicts the next horizon and chooses a control vector that minimizes an objective J, which is the weighted sum over the horizon of comfort deviations, moisture risk, indoor quality deviations, and energy use deviations. Because it is a residing horizon, the algorithm re-optimizes each interval with real-time data, giving gradual corrections towards the target over a period while penalizing extreme actions or spontaneous actions. As safety bounds to guide control decisions, a lot of parameters and constraints have been defined for safety margins. Moving on. As the meta controller, I explained that I'm using a statistical technique known as Bayesian optimization. Bayes-opt treats the objective J as a black box of policy weights, and because there are no gradients, Bayes-opt builds a probabilistic surrogate through a Gaussian process to yield both a best estimate of function J alpha and its uncertainty. The Bayes-opt seeks different weights in response to safety gates that I have been developing, in this case called risk flags that are computed based on predictions, but also from physics-based APIs that trigger when a horizon is expected to exceed certain thresholds that signal particular risks. Considering scalability or adaptability, the predictor is updated on a rolling basis. Batches of 6, 12, and 24 hours are tested to find the best cadence as patterns shift. Each update comes with a light hyperparameter tuning, and to avoid concept drift, I investigated multiple approaches, among them specifically a regularization term called elastic weight consolidation, which is which keeps important weights that has already learned before, but allows the model to gradually learn new patterns without forgetting core knowledge. So if successful, the goal would be to cut the adaptation time and make the continual learning loop faster. So this is just explaining some more validation steps. And finally, I'm just going to talk very briefly, as short as I can, about a preliminary study that I conducted. So some of the data that I have available through the lab setting are typical indoor condition data from sensors. Also some operation data, typically in loads or percentage. And, sorry, I mentioned that first, but weather data. Temporal features were encoded as well to support time awareness. So clusters were defined through principal component analysis at first, but big imbalance was shown through in terms of clustering as shown here. So a different way was explored where first looking at established rules of climate regimes by different scientists over a long period of time. And so I applied within that and also applying a data-driven approach, a k-means cluster to define 5 different centroids and assign each point to the nearest one. So the result is a much more balanced cluster size for each of the data in an annual pattern. Also, because there are no cameras or dedicated occupancy sensors for every space in my study setting, an inference method was developed using occupancy based on CO2 and moisture dynamics. Starting from Lavoisier's mass balance equation under the assumption of a well-mixed mass balance equation, the internal source loads for each CO2 and moisture were isolated and discretized with backward difference over k minutes to eliminate noise. This process gives me a rough estimate of an occupancy index where it goes from 0 to 1, 1 heavily occupied to 0 just not occupied. In this, I'm also adding a simple regression system in between to consider the window opening when perhaps these levels of moisture or CO2 get flushed, but also wind speed. What are the ventilation potentials that influence this decaying of fluctuations? So to search a model, multiple models that have been already proven to be effective within the aspect of humidity and temperature were tested. And I'm just going to show some of the models that were explored. A baseline linear regression, a polynomial regression that was used by Rahman in 2020, a random forest regression, and an extreme gradient boost. And, oh, sorry, I should have showed that. But the extreme gradient boost proved to be, it's a very popular tree gradient boosted decision tree model. And it proved to be the best performing model among everything. So I'm using that as the benchmark. But unfortunately, the extreme gradient boost is not like quite efficient for time series or actual multiple trajectories in the future, in a future horizon. So why explore different models? To adapt a sequential and time series based model, which is in this case is going to be mostly an LSTM. LSTM is a sequential model where it takes a past window and uses a future horizon to predict the trajectory ahead, multiple minutes ahead in this case. So the extreme gradient boost was turned into sequential first to test as a benchmark, and then I tested an existing long LSTM framework with my data. And I started working around that first. So some hyperparameter tuning and some architecture defining where I'm creating a high-level representation layer. And because it's a multi-target model, I'm creating multiple different branches that specifically focus on the exact target that they should be working on. In this case, lab temperature, zone temperature, relative humidity, and CO2. And the result was actually very promising in terms of like predicting, at least exceeding the results of the extreme gradient boost. So having done that, the model was modified a bit, and then just improved over time with later on with encoder and decoder systems. And finally, like this is the result that I achieved. Like this is my model with the LSTM full autoregressive system, which achieved much better results. And as of now, I believe I exceeded the results of the benchmark that I've set for the model at least. And then for the control algorithm, I'm looking at the methods of defining different penalties, constraints, and thresholds that are implemented within the model. A lot of this come from physics-driven safety margins that are used from APIs dedicated to these, such as Energy Plus or Synergym, but also in those cases where I cannot get those, I am calculating directly with physics-driven equations. In this case, a surface dew point margin, a ventilation potential margin, enthalpy compass index, and several guards to define what I'm calling a latent heat favorable condition and also a sensible heat favorable condition. the result of the preliminary study shows the prediction and the results of when the MPC was applied. I have two different tests where I am fitting the MPC on a relative humidity-based approach and another on humidity ratio approach. The bottom is showing the humidity ratio-based approach where it seeks to keep always somewhere in between the thresholds of less than 8 or 9 grams per kilogram of water vapor per dry air, because an accumulation of over 12 hours of that would be signaling a risk of mold. As for on the top, it's simply just trying to reduce the relative humidity. So along with this, I plugged in a PyThermal comfort tool, which is a comfort tool developed by Center for Built Environment of Berkeley to address the PMB and the PMB for comfort evaluation. This is as of it my research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your great presentation. A lot of holistic work that you put together. I think a quick question is, what system did you test on, and how fast the system can respond to radiant cooling or heating system? Is your algorithm has that promise and opportunity for any radiant cooling or radiant heating system at all?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you. Right now, the control factors that I'm working at, so the control elements that I'm working with are currently kind of biased right now. I'm just stuck with the lab setting, which are basically the window operations and also cooling and heating. But these cooling and heating are based on a thermal activated systems from radiant floor heating or cooling. So there is definitely a lot of delay in getting a cooling effect or heating effect. So the focus right now within humidity and my research is that I'm less trying to rely on cooling and heating as of now, because the systems that I'm testing are very slow, and I'm also considering the thermal inertia of the material of the floor. It's a very slow process that I have not been able to address yet fully, because my algorithm works within a predicted horizon of 6 hours only. And that is not enough to address the full cooling or heating state change. So although I did put placeholders as of now in the algorithm, where if the passive systems that I'm working on fail to address moisture removal or moisture imports, there must be a alternative, which in this case I'm considering the mechanical systems for cooling or heating, or even ventilation systems that are dedicated for dehumidification or such. So as long as these systems can be recognized within the central layer of control that I'm working on, the potentials for controlling multiple different systems is definitely feasible.
I just have a quick thought, because I think your algorithm really benefits with moisture removal, and it really makes me think that, if we're talking about office buildings or all these campus buildings, then we have to talk about humidity within a reasonable level. Then humidity removal maybe is not really top priority, but data centers, right?
Yes.
We don't have to care about the heat that much, but the moisture has to be removed fast and effectively.
Exactly.
So I think, in the future, if you think to test the validity of your control algorithm, maybe you can start with the data center. It's just the comment from me. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent suggestion. Thank you so much.
All right, I know we're running a little bit over time, so this is the last presentation we have for today. As I was the one who started the conversation with you this morning, I'm also the one to be concluding it, so I'd love to have your time for a little bit, like 10-15 minutes, and then we can move forward to the reception. I'll try to be as concise as I can. So this is the work that I've been working on in my doctorate. So this is microdevelopment and affordable housing capacity in emerging markets. Not able. Okay, there we go. So just going over what I've been going over real quick today, some definitions that the work has been setting, the question in hand, what is the research question mainly, and the approach that I'm taking to target it, and then preliminary results and significance. So this is work in progress, things have not been polished yet. I still have a little bit more time to graduate, so this is work that I'm putting together, but definitely there's a lot more next steps to come through. So just starting off with the literature review, which enabled me to really situate my work within a theoretical framework. So this diagram shows the intersection of entrepreneurship, development, and urban economics, and highlights how these different theories help us understand housing challenges and solutions. So we've seen all throughout the day, this wide range of panels that housing can mean a lot to different people in different ways, and we're all trying to really get at it and answer these questions better, but from very different angles. So this is kind of the framing that I'm considering. So we have barefoot economies, which is a theory that is really about how local resource for entrepreneurs creatively meet community needs with limited resources. We have the capability philosophy on the other side, emphasizing that housing isn't just a commodity, but rather it's about expanding people's real freedoms and life opportunities. With that comes, of course, the question about the politics of poverty and highlighting those structural inequalities that we've really grasped with and grappled with this morning in the morning's conversation and also the afternoon one. And finally, the one that really interests me more with this framing of entrepreneurship and housing is the push and pull theory. Are people, housing, it seems to be really at this nexus of this question. Are people pulled into investing in real estate opportunities, so there is an opportunity there, or are we pushed to it because we need housing? So it's this crisis, but it's also this opportunity that's presented there. So what if we can imagine together having actors positioned right at the center of this diagram of these three fields embodying all these insights. And these are, in my definition, or what I want to really discuss and investigate with you all here, these micro-developers, what I call micro-developers. And they're local innovators who navigate economic realities, respond to social needs, and translate these theories into practical housing solutions. But let's learn more about it together and see what that is like. So, just for context, this is based off one case study that I've been really invested in all throughout my master's, but also my doctoral work. So it is in Cape Town, South Africa. We have 30 years of government waiting lists to qualify for public housing. So in that context, in emerging markets, housing is really pulled on the government to handle. So they provide free housing, and that is what public housing here really means, because public housing means different things in different settings. And with that being said, there is a backlog of that database that surpasses 400,000 applicants. So obviously, as we can see from this very simple context slide, there is a backlog of housing. So what happens on ground? We have informal settlements, particularly in townships. So township is a term that was used particularly in the South African context to frame where people post-1994 have lived a bit in the outskirts. But at the same time, with that being said, we do see these kind of announcements, making headlights in big newspapers, in Bloomberg, in Fast Company, and so on, about these backyard micro flats aiming to erase South Africa's housing crisis. This was actually very recently published in, I think in April, on Bloomberg. So, and again, Cape Town's housing crisis, micro developers gain momentum with new regulations. So who are these micro developers and what do they do? So when I came across that a few years ago, I really wanted to see what does that look like, right? So this is the kind of buildings they're building. And I am from Algeria, and we do have informal settlements also where I'm from, and they do not look like this. This is not informal settlements. These are built properly. They're using structural, they're using, plans. It's not congregated sheets and so on. It's not what you really imagine when you think about informal settlements. And they do meet building codes, they do have, they're on the path of getting their title deeds, so there is definitely room for regulation. So what is really going on? So where do we see that? Again, contextualizing the work that I'm discussing here. We see it in townships, Langal, Delft, Kailicha, and so on. And numerically, again, to really make sense of those newspaper articles that I just highlighted here, there's 190 units, there is 889 units, 506, all these are different institutes, like financial institutes that work on housing that reported these numbers. Building, so if you put all those things together, that's a large number of units from 2018 to 2024 that are being rented. So this is, we're talking about the rental market here particularly, and they're serving about 2,170 tenants. And that is definitely something when it comes to a backlog of 30 years of housing, right? So they're doing something, they're contributing to reducing that backlog, but they're not being documented. Okay, so again, microdeveloper being a very new emerging term in academia, my question was, how does microdevelopers, if I were to position them in this angle of like entrepreneurship and housing, how do they differentiate or compare to other entrepreneurial ventures? And again, when we try to conceptualize entrepreneurship as this creative, social, collective organizing process that materializes in a venture, which is, again, this is a cited definition of what entrepreneurship is, it becomes conceived as the performance of various real practices through which practitioners develop new meaning to transform practical knowledge. And they develop new associations between actual practices. Hence, can we maybe say that microdevelopment, now again, we're still trying to understand it, is a form of entrepreneurship? Maybe, let's see. So again, this is what I'm kind of framing as my hypothesis. So a little bit background before I dive deeper into the work that I've been doing. So let's discuss more this intersection of housing and entrepreneurship policies. So housing and entrepreneurship policies and their outcomes are definitely inexplicably linked. Both decisions to become an entrepreneur and also to become a homeowner are driven by very similar factors such as risk aversion, wealth, liquidity, and I'm having an issue moving my slides, sorry. There we go. So again, going back to placing this work in numerical measures, there we go. There we go. So again, if we're claiming that there is a new classification of developers, these micro-developers that are coming into the affordable housing space, how do they differentiate themselves? So we had to make a classification in terms of context, where do they operate? Who are they in terms of scale, how many units they build, where do they get their funding from, their geographical focus, their economic context, and also the political context matters, as we have seen from these conversations that we came up today. We keep coming back to the policy piece. And again, in the similar train of thought about these numerical metrics to really understand and define and ground who the micro-developers are and what do they do. Again, we look at their costs, their project costs, construction period, the field, the annual rental rates, the construction loan payment. Again, a lot of the numbers here, they're in Rand, which is the South African currency, but I've tried to still provide like an estimate in USD dollars just for explanatory purposes. But you can see that they're becoming this distinct subclass category of developers. They're not small-sized developers, they're not medium-sized developers, they're not also large-sized developers, but rather maybe they're under the small-sized developer, but they're very much distinct, even numerically, not just theoretically, as I had highlighted in the beginning. So with that comes what my work is trying to say, that micro-development is a distinct emerging entrepreneurial practice in developing markets that addresses the supply and demand for affordable housing by transforming informal housing into formal structures. So they operate in townships. As I had mentioned, townships used to be informal areas, but now there are processes in place to gain their title deed. And because these areas in the past used to be in the outskirts of the cities, but now because of the urban sprawl, they became part of the cities, their land value has increased. And when you get the paperwork intact, the land value really increases, making it a very viable real estate market, particularly for the rental segment. And it seems, at least my hypothesis was at this point, is that maybe they're contributing. And that's kind of what I'm trying to investigate. Are they contributing to creating affordable housing stock that is viable for people, that is fulfilling a need that the government is failing to fulfill? Maybe. Let's see. Why is this relevant, this work? Because again, it's helping us understand an immersion development practice of microdevelopment. There's a lot written about it. There is we're hoping to draw some parallels to scalability and replicability, and we're hoping that this applies to a diverse audience, including, again, policymakers, urban planners, developers, entrepreneurs, and academics and researchers. So I think that's a good way to end on, because, again, that's kind of the wide range of disciplines that we have brought together in this conference. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it.